All right, remember, these are the things. This is what a good test should tell us, all of these particular things right here. We would like to know them. So let's ask the question if this PCR test for COVID actually does these things for us. First, what is the PCR? It stands for polymerase chain reaction. There are these cycles. What you're looking at here on this graphic shows that there are two little pieces of DNA in there, and they get amplified in this process, and they get turned into 4, and then they get turned into 8, into 16, into 32. It's a doubling cycle. And so after 10 cycles, what we see here is that the signal has been multiplied by 1,000-fold, just over 1,000-fold. And after 20 cycles, it's just over 1 million. After 30 cycles, it's just over 1 billion. After 40 cycles, you've amplified the signal by just over 8 trillion, 1.1 trillion. So roughly 1,000-fold increase in signal for each 10-fold increase in cycles. So what this means is that if you can detect the virus after just 10 cycles, you really got a lot of virus particles in you. And if you can detect it after 20 cycles, you still have a lot of viruses in you. At 30 cycles, starts to get a little iffy. After about 40 cycles, it's probably meaningless. And we're going to discuss why that is. By the way, all this came from the September 1st video titled Bad Testing. And there's the link to it right down there if you want to go back and review this sort of stuff. And this is also from September 1st, to repeat it here, to review it. Cycle threshold is just too damn high. So in July, they noted here this lab identified 794 positive tests based on a threshold of 40 cycles. Wow. It means in Massachusetts, with the cutoff of just 35 cycles, about half the tests would no longer be called positive. So remember, with like, oh my God, 160,000 cases in the US. But if that's at 40 cycles, and we said, no, the new threshold's 35, that would probably drop to 80,000 cases, right? And if we said the threshold was 30, it would probably drop again by a similar amount. Okay, another half. All right, and about 70% would no longer be judged positive if the cycles were limited to 30, and so on. All right, in Massachusetts, 85 to 90% of people who tested positive in July with a cycle threshold of 40 would have been deemed negative if the threshold were 30 cycles. 85 to 90% if we cut it off at 30. So obviously this is really critical. Where are you drawing the line? Where do you consider somebody COVID positive or SARS-2 positive, right? Well, what do you mean by positive? Can we detect that they ever had the virus, or are we trying to detect if they are infectious? That ought to be the goal here, not to detect who already had been infected or who might be a false positive or anything like that. So the question then comes down to, well, where are you drawing the cutoff, and why? So there was a really important piece of work that I also outlined in September, I think back in, when was that? I forget. It's back in May, probably. May or June. And it talked about the strong inverse correlation between SARS-CoV-2 infectivity and cycle threshold value. Let me break that down. An inverse correlation is where one number is going up, another number is going down. A positive correlation, or a correlation, is where one number is going up and another number is going up. So we have crossing numbers in this story. And what they're talking about here is that SARS-CoV-2 infectivity and the cycle thresholds cross. So as the cycle threshold is going up and up and up, the infectivity is going down and down and down. So that's what they're talking about here. And what they found was really fascinating. So in order to test if somebody's actually infective, you swab somebody, you find that the PCR test says, hey, they're positive. You check how many cycles it took to get there, and then they would see if they could culture that virus sample into cells to see if they could actually infect cells. Because if it can't infect cells, it's not a live virus and it's not infectious, and that's the way it goes about it. All right, they found that cycle thresholds above 33 to 34 are not contagious, and that these people could be discharged from hospital care. Fauci even mentioned this, that a cycle threshold of over 35 is probably meaningless, at least from a standpoint of asking or answering the question, am I infectious? Or is this person or party infectious? The answer is above 33, 34, maybe 35, but somewhere in that band, above that level, somebody will test positive, but they're not infectious. They at best have dead virus particles in them. So this seems important, right? Of course it is. Seems very important. Now, a super important paper just came out recently, and a number of you sent this to me, and it's a bunch of scientists, really a bunch of heavy hitters here. These are all very, very established scientists down here. Big, giant list of them. And what they were reviewing was this Corman-Drosten et al. There was a paper that came out suspiciously. It was submitted on January 20th. Before, I think there were only 6 deaths from COVID worldwide. And this paper got submitted saying, oh my gosh, we're going to need this huge ability to test publicly for this COVID thing coming along. It wasn't called COVID at the time. And the paper was accepted by January 21st, 24 hours, barely any time for peer review in there. And these people noticed that when they did the external peer review of this test protocol paper that came out to detect SARS-CoV-2, revealed that it was just riddled with scientific flaws at both the molecular and the methodological levels. And so it had huge consequences for false positives. And they're just basically saying, really poorly done paper, it needs to be retracted. I won't go into all of that right now, but I will say that they had a number of interesting comments in here. And they say it should be noted there is no mention anywhere in the Corman-Drosten paper of a test being positive or negative, or indeed what defines a positive or a negative result. So again, where do you draw that line? Where would you say we have a positive case, where's a negative case, right? I'm making the argument that anything from 35 and up ought to be considered negative. And we'll parse that out a little bit more, but generally speaking, anything under 35, hey, that's a positive. So these types of virological diagnostic tests, they say, must be based on an SOP, a standard operating procedure, including a validated and fixed number of PCR cycles, the CT, the cycle threshold values, after which a sample is deemed positive or negative. Positive with a lower number, negative with a higher number, because it's an inverse correlation. The maximum reasonably reliable cycle value is 30 cycles, they say here. Above a CT of 35 cycles, rapidly increasing numbers of false positives must be expected. And these are people who know what they're talking about. These are all experts in this sort of testing. So that's where they're drawing the line. 30, that's conservative. I'm pretty sure that if you're below 30, you have a very positive test there. So they say here, continuing this paper, between 30 and 35 is a gray area where a positive test cannot be established with certainty. This area should be excluded. Of course, one could perform 45 PCR cycles as recommended in this Corman-Drosten WHO protocol, but then you also have to define a reasonable CT value, which should not exceed 30. But an analytical result with a CT value of 45 is scientifically and diagnostically absolutely meaningless. That's very polite science speak. Let me translate science that from out of science speak. Scientifically and diagnostically absolutely meaningless. Garbage. You're garbage. You get readings at 45. It's diagnostically useless because there's nothing you can do with that except to say it's a false positive or this person is no longer infectious at this case. So why you would set the cycle threshold of 45 is very, very bizarre. Because again, we have all this data that says, this is actual data from a lab which says if you culture these things, you can't extract a live virus from a cycle threshold above 33 or 34. That's it. There's no live virus in there anymore. When you're detecting those fragments of virus from above a cycle threshold of 34, you're just detecting dead particles at that point in time. That's the conclusion. That's what the data says. So you would think that in a sane and just society where we're worried about destroying people's livelihoods, or we really actually want to get our arms around what kind of a public health emergency we have, or we want to know where the virus is actively spreading. If you want that level of information, you absolutely have to know the cycle thresholds. They ought to be reported and reported on a daily basis, but they're really not. So I said 45, nobody would do 45. They must have mistyped something. So I went to the WHO PCR test instructions, just downloaded it today on December 1st. This is where it is that, you can, all the links, of course, are down below in the description down there below this if you want to track them down. And sure enough, actually, they have one cycle of the first transcription, then they have another cycle, initial denaturation, and then 45. They're recommending 45 cycles. The WHO is 45. That's scientifically indefensible. I can't find any explanation for why you would want to have a cycle threshold at 45 when, again, if we said 35 is where we would cut it off for sure, and Fauci says above 35, probably not infectious. But you go to 45, remember that's a 1,000-fold amplification from there to there. So your people who might be 1,000 times below any infectious limit, 1,000 times are still being dinged as positives under this test protocol. So remember, tests show that live SARS-CoV-2, it cannot be cultured from stuff where the cycle threshold was 35 or greater. Thus, anything over 35, anything, absolutely has to be confirmed with clinical symptoms to be declared a positive. You can't just say our swab came back with a positive at a CT of 37 or 39 or 40 or 45 and call that a positive, because it's a meaningless, positive what? It's a meaningless number. So here's how you interpret this stuff. Remember, I told you there was one question that you were gonna ask. If you get a SARS-CoV-2 positive test, your first question back to your healthcare provider, your lab, whoever that is, wherever you got that result from, is to say, at what cycle threshold was I positive? Because if you have a positive PCR result with a cycle threshold of 30 or lower here, you got to treat this. You got to treat it accordingly. You got to get on many of the, if you're on an outpatient basis, all the outpatient treatments we've been talking about so far, those would be things you would absolutely want to get your hands on as soon as possible. The EVMS protocol would be a great one. More broadly speaking, ivermectin, selenium, vitamin D, things like that would be very, very helpful to get on in zinc right away. A CT between 30 and 35 is increasingly suspect. It may indicate an active infection, or maybe an inactive one. It might be a false positive. So you would want to take prophylactic measures if you had a CT between 30 and 35, but I personally wouldn't be worrying too much. You have a much lower level of that infection. Remember, the amount of viral load you have determines how sick you get. That's a positive correlation. The more virus you get, the worse your COVID symptoms are going to be. So if you had a cycle threshold at like 12, dude, you're going to have a bad run at this thing. 17, this is not going to be cool. 20 even, 25. By the time you get to 30, you have a lot less viral load in you. By the time you get to 35, probably not that much. So I would say any cycle threshold between 35 and 40 is increasingly noisy, that is useless. It might be that you're asymptomatic. It might be that you've gotten over it. It might be at the very, very early stages, so there's a small possibility of that too. But unless clinical symptoms are present, there's really nothing to worry about here at this level either. And any CT positive result over 40, I would call complete garbage, or more gently, scientifically and diagnostically meaningless. And the WHO's test standard with a CT of 45, that would be beyond garbage. We would be one step further, or 5 full steps further. So this is how you would interpret this. If I got a positive test result, my first question is, at what cycle? What's my cycle threshold? Where was that detected? I need to know that. So that's really important data. And if that doesn't come back with your test, it's just positive or negative, it's not a good test, it's not a good lab. You should know the cycle thresholds. That should be known. In fact, that ought to be reported all over the place. We would like to know if on average, where we see cases, or where they're calling cases, but are actually detected infections, we'd like to know what's the average cycle threshold of those, because that gives us a sense of where we are. If the average is at 30, like, geez, that's a raging infection probably in your area. If it's 40, who cares, right? All right.